Good afternoon, friends. I understand we are reaching the last week of January, but since this is our first meeting this year, let me wish all our listeners a very successful and healthy 2019 on behalf of the entire SoftwareTestPro team. Welcome to the STP training webinar, which is Intro to Postmodern Testing. Our speaker for the day is Jason Arbon. I'm Smita Mishra, a professional tester myself, and I'm excited to host you all and Jason on our STP training webinars. Quick information for all of you. The next upcoming conference we have is Spring 2019 STPCon, which will be held at San Francisco from April 1st to 4th in 2019. The program is up for your review, and the early bird pricing ends on 8th of Feb. So you have an opportunity to save up to $300 there. And if you do plan to attend the conference, don't forget there are various offers for alumni attendees and team registrations. If you have any queries, do email them to info@softwaretestpro.com. Another quick piece of information I have for you is there is an upcoming webinar, the QA role, supporting DevOps the smart way, by Melissa Tondi on the 13th of February. Melissa is the director at Disrupt Testing, and she's also the founder of Denver Mobile and Quality. She's a very well-known authority on testing, and the link is up for your review. Please do go for it and register. Let's get started with the webinar today. A very warm welcome, Jason. We are very thrilled to have you with us today. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. Jason Arbon is the CEO at Test.ai, where his mission is to test all the world's apps. Google's AI investment arm led Test.ai's latest funding round. Jason previously worked on several large-scale products, web search at Google and Bing, the web browsers, Chrome and Internet Explorer, operating systems such as Windows and Chrome OS, and crowdsourced testing at uTest.com. Jason has also co-authored books such as How Google Tests Software and App Quality, Secrets for Agile App. You will find links to both these books on Software Test Pro site. And just so you know, Jason will be delivering a workshop, keynote, and session at the upcoming STPCon. So let me transfer the control to you now, Jason. A very warm welcome again, and the floor is all yours now.
Great, thanks, Smita. It's a genuinely fun to be associated with STP because I've always felt like the cool people were always showing up there, so it's fun to be part of it. And I'm a software test professional myself. So cool. So yeah, my name is Jason Arbon, and I want to just share what I've been thinking about, about my thoughts on postmodern testing. We'll get into why it's called postmodern, but it's kind of a collection of my thoughts around best practices and how do we combine what we know as a community of testers from technology, tools, methodologies, how do we combine them to be the best possible testers and have the best possible test strategies on the planet. I think it's really time for us to kind of reevaluate and reassess how we test. In case you're curious, this is the building that I'm broadcasting from. It's our new offices after we closed the last funding round. And I'm in the second to top up there. So let's get going. So if I can hit click next there, awesome. I'm brilliant. All right. So what does this modern world mean, right? You kind of think it means after modern, but really what it means is it's a movement that happened in the world. Because I'm a closet art history kind of nerd and buff, but basically what postmodernism is it understands classical architecture. So architecture of the past, right? Like the Greeks, the Romans, the even grass huts, right, of early man and cave dwelling. And it also understands modern architecture, which is today very rectangular, steel, efficient buildings, right? But modernism is now you've kind of figured out and optimized everything. What do you do? Well, what you do is you build new buildings with leveraging all the tools and techniques you've accumulated over history, but you don't have a separate, unique identity. What you do is you basically take the best from all other identities other efforts and evolutions in art, and you combine them and to create something new. So you take the best parts of these old movements, and you throw away the bad parts, and then you throw a little extra twist on it, right? You have a little extra creative twist and innovation on top of that. And that's really what postmodern architecture is in this case. And so we'll be doing the same thing, the same kind of thought experiment in how testing will evolve. So I always hate when somebody reads something on the slide directly, but I'm going to do it because it's so concise and beautiful, and I am not very efficient speaking. Wikipedia calls postmodern art a collage, simplification, appropriation, performance art, the recycling of past styles and themes in a modern day context, and the breakup of the barrier between fine and high arts, and also references popular culture, right? If you think about software testing today, if you go to a conference or you watch enough webinars or you read enough books, they're all siloed ways of doing testing. They're also pretty linear, right? Like they're created at a certain time, and they don't really know that much. And then they all have some anti-patterns in there and some good patterns in there, good things and bad things. But really, if you look around, most webinars are talking about how do you, like, one of these, we'll call them what they are, like religions, right? Just one of these religions, one of these tools, one of these, it's always the best tool or the best approach or whatever. Things are very situational, right? Depends a lot on context. I don't mean the context of the app, like context-based testing. I mean the context of the business, of the software, of cadence of the shipping. It's very contextual. And you have to pull from all these other methodologies and technology to put the right thing together for your problem. So if we look at software today, modern software, there's really three major types of software. People are either working on a platform, they're testing a platform, say Chrome browser, it's Windows, it's Android, some kind of platform, right? It could be, the Rift, it could be anything like that's a platform. And there's other companies and software stacks that are focused more on data, say AI and machine learning, and usually deliver their stuff over microservices, right? Like remote API calls over the internet. And there's another set of representative kind of applications in the world. Well, these are very complex client apps. So whether it's a mobile app or a web page, not only those like applications and geared toward the end user and have a UI, but they're also very complex. They're far sophisticated than they were even 5 to 10 years ago. There's a lot because the platforms of the machines have gotten so much more powerful that a lot of that processing has been off of the clients. But that means it's a really difficult testing problem. And not only are most people testing something in one of these verticals, but usually you're combining one or two of these things. You have data and API microservices combined with a local client with AI built into it. So these problems are getting very complex, and you really can't just say whatever worked on Chrome should work on an app, right? Or whatever works for Google search should work on Chrome, for example. So really we need to sit back and take a mashup of all the things we've learned, all the tools and techniques, and then reassess how we put these together to perform, kind of a postmodern approach to engineering, software engineering and testing. So there's a few assertions that I think are pretty important in the context of postmodern testing. One is ignore dogmas, right? If you look at this picture, obviously the interesting building is in the foreground here. If you look in the background, there's lots of towers, right? There's lots of other buildings, slightly different styles. There's even low-slung buildings in the background. There's probably residential things in the background, like single-family homes in the background and apartment buildings. But what you're looking at is this looks like the culmination of all the other previous architecture, right? This bizarre building with the hole in the middle. There's a couple things to think about it that kind of represent postmodern testing. Is when you look at that, you go, that's very interesting. Like whoever did that really thought about it. They really cared about it, and they were creative, right? Why do you punch a hole in a building? Like, is that stable? Is that strong enough? Like, why are those lines on there? Not like a standard like grid of a fixed size. So somebody's taken a very artistic approach push the limits of materials science and engineering. They obviously understand the basics because the thing was built and constructed. It's amazing. And they had a twist to it. They were so competent in what they're doing. They took all the lessons learned from previous architecture and they add this twist to it, right? Which is they literally, in this case, physically looks like it twisted the building and they punched a hole in it. So when you think about what postmodern software testing is, think about doing that to the best practices and learnings, tools, and data that you're applying today and the ones you've heard of. So postmodern testing is also about mixing and matching things, even mixing and matching similar things, right? And almost to a comedic effect, like to make it interesting. Like testing is sometimes so dang boring. Like it can be just add n more test cases this week, right? And ad nauseum for the next like 6 months. It can be really boring. Postmodernism is also about having a little bit of fun, having a little bit of flair, right? Like an interesting twist on stuff. So if you look at this building, if you ignore all those artifices, right, on the outside, it's basically a square building, right? But how fun is that? Like testing is boring. How do we think about how to make it more exciting, more interesting? And it just takes a little bit of effort. The core of the building is a pretty standard building. They just have slightly different window sizes and add these little extra things on, right? But now it's an incredibly interesting building to live in. So think about it with your testing. Like we want to make testing also like more fun, more engaging, more interesting, not just to ourselves, to attract people into the field, but to keep people in the field, and to make other people in the world actually care about what we do. There's also, as always, in testers, especially because I guess we're testers, there's things that are good and things that are bad, right? I definitely see and hear things that I have seen tried many times over, and it's always a bad idea. So, for example, in the architecture world, like this building is postmodern, but guess what? Guarantee it wasn't built on mud with no foundation, right? There's just basic things. There's physical limits of materials. There's basic things you cannot do, right? You have to have doors on the street level for people to get into the building. There's just basic constraints of things that you do and you just do not do in architecture. You also don't build a skyscraper out of wood. Not a good idea, right? So there are basic limits and things that have been proven to be good and not good. So even if somebody woke up tomorrow in a postmodern building, and they decide to make a tower of wood, well, the city code is not going to let them do it, and you know what's going to happen to the building, right? So as much we want to have fun and innovation and experimentation, there are engineering boundaries and limitations that they're physical constants in nature that you can't avoid. And then lastly, it's about kind of being brave, right, and creative. I think testers have been, just because it's an amount of work, they're sometimes relegated to the cubicle across the hall, or they're remote. They don't feel that connected, and they don't feel that brave, right? They don't feel like there's an opportunity to be creative or be brave. There's not enough time to be creative or brave. And also, testers are often conservative by nature, right? We actually want things to work. We don't want things to break. We worry about risk all the time, right? But we need to think about embracing risk, because in embracing risk and taking risks, as a profession, we'll discover new and awesome new ways to do what we do. This building is interesting. It's an example of, they know there's a boring apartment complexes. This guy looks like he kind of cut it up, melted it together, but it stands. It's probably very sturdy. He knows the material science. He knows the engineering. He knows there's a thing called gravity. And he built like an interesting building, right? It's probably still functional, which is difficult to do. It's easy to build a square building and make it functional. This is difficult. This is a high art, right? And then he's got this bizarre edifice or something up, right? You go, why is he doing that? It almost looks like, you look at, there's like glass in there. Like maybe it means there's a giant lit atrium, right? Which is very unusual, but be beautifully fun thing to be walking around inside the building if you got a beautiful, well lit atrium in there. Like, what's going on? You're thinking about it. This person thought a lot about this building. So I want people to look at testing and postmodern testing as like, wow, they really know their art, they know their field, and they're selectively applying things, and they know it so well that they can do a twist on it. They can do a creative twist on this thing, right? And we'll get into very boring technical details about this, but that's kind of the flavor of how I think we're kind of entering into the new world. We need to, as a field, enter into more of a postmodern kind of approach to our profession. Now, there's a funny thing I only noticed when I went through the slides earlier, making sure that I could actually speak to them. And if you look at the building, I'll just say this: once you see it, you can't unsee it. But this looks something like a possible U.S. president, is all I'll say. And I didn't realize that until like a couple hours ago. It's kind of funny. Anyway, we'll move along. So let's get the nitty gritty here. Like, what does postmodern stuff look like? I've been in a lot of test organizations, right? I've been a manager, I've been an individual contributor, I've been a director, a CEO now. I've been in tiny startups with literally just me in a coffee shop, to mid-sized businesses that are growing fast, to businesses that have kind of stagnated, to giant corps, right? Of like Microsoft and Google. And I've spoken with a lot of people on all the app teams around the world, right? Literally hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of I've seen test suites and bugs for thousands of apps across the planet. And so I've seen a lot of this, how organization impact stuff. There's some very clear lessons I've learned, which are probably, some of these things are probably controversial, but usually when I say something's controversial, people are like, oh no, that makes sense. And they just life. But there's, and by the way, I've been in organizations where they keep changing how the test fits into the organization because it never works right. There's always space-time trade-offs, right? So when you have centralized testing, a lot of bad things happen. So what I've seen work kind of best and is the most productive, especially for modern software development, not software testing of 30, 20, or even 10 years ago, but today, is that testers should report directly into whoever is the person that owns the project from an engineering perspective, not the PM, not a director of testing, not the CTO, but they report, and not an individual developer. They need to report into the person that owns engineering for a deliverable, like a product, right? Whatever that is, a shippable unit of work. And the reason is, kind of, you can get too deep on these things, a lot of assertions in here. But one of the main things to think about is that that's the person that needs to know the output of the QA and testing team, right? Because they make the architectural decisions, they make the day-to-day engineering decisions that affect quality. They need to know about quality. It can't be passed through indirectly or whatever. And more importantly, if that person doesn't want testing or QA to report to them, there's a whole lot of dysfunction, because then you've got this whole like throw it over the fence problem going on, or they'll make design engineering decisions without QA involved, and it's just a horrible mess. I know testers live in the situations they live in, and it's not always optimal, but I'm just being very clear that I've seen that it's very suboptimal to have anything less than that going on. The closer you can get to that model, the better your test kind of organization is. That also means aggressively no shared or infrastructure, but among teams. You have a company with like 10 different teams. Those testers should actually operate very independently. They can communicate, share stuff here and there. There should not be a centralized lab for test execution or for some sort of excellence, right? Or architects or anything like that, because every team today is a different mashup of these types of software architectures and problems. So we go from UI to data to analytics to programmability and scale and reliability. Like, there's very different problems. Each team is usually building something different. So to have this top-down monolithic approach that usually is just one of these vertical approaches or dogmas means you can have lots of problems. So that's enough. We talk for days on this stuff. And over the next year, I'll be sharing deeper dives on kind of all these topics. This is kind of, again, it's an introduction to postmodern testing. So there's another big thing that's kind of, it's a heated drama thing in the hallways for people to talk about, but it's kind of drummed up, to be frank. But there's just a lot of discussion between, testing or checking. I call checking verification because it's the more formal, like scientific way to describe it. But testing is trying to break the software. And verification is just making sure that it works as expected. The problem is that people are trying to think that as a tester or as a test team, are we testing or are we doing verification, or what do we do, a blend? And if it's a blend, what's that? I don't know, I'm confused, and I'm just going to go back to my desk, right? And then people that talk a lot try to create debates around it. But it's actually pretty simple. I think that I've tested it against different organizations I've been in and talking to other people. And there's this I call it the TVV ratio. But it's basically the test versus verification ratio. So how do you allocate your time, money, resources between testing and verification tasks? They're very different, right? Um, and that's simply, you just take the average of three things. So how complex is the software? How dangerous is the software? Can it kill people? And the speed of, and just the velocity. So how often is it changing, or how often is it shipping? And if you kind of average those three things, you kind of come up with a pretty good smart ratio of how testing you should do versus verification. For example, if it's very dangerous, you should do a lot of testing. You can't really deal with edge cases, right? But at the same time, if it and also if your thing ships continuously, for example, it's a very fast project and shipping every day, you have to do a whole lot of verification because anything could break at any moment and impact the customer, right? So you need to make sure it still works as the priority, for example. But it's a pretty quick way. You can do it on a piece of paper, a napkin in like 5 minutes. Just create three numbers, compute the average, which everyone here should be able to do, and you know how to organize your own personal time if you're the only tester, or you know how to allocate headcount if you have a testing team. Now I outsourced this to a graphics design agency, and sorry, sarcasm doesn't go over very well when you're talking to yourself on a webinar. Um, but when you come up with that ratio of verification and testing, if the number is greater than 80%, or it's lower than 20%, something's very wrong. That means you might be making something that is, not only is this that don't change those ratios past 80-20, but also means that you might be making something very complex, very dangerous, very fast. It's not a good idea, right? Or you might be working on something completely boring and simple, no danger to anyone, causes no damage if it's broken, and is incredibly slow. So at the extremes, they're actually bizarro projects. So most everybody kind of fits somewhere in the middle there, to go past an 80-20 rule. But again, this is more, we understand how projects work. We know that these are three major contributors, like architects, to like building a building, like the material, the site, and the function of the building, right? For example, and we have to blend these these aspects of reality when we come up with our test strategy. But we've seen enough of it that we kind of know that how to measure this ratio and how to apply it to our testing. So there's another big topic everybody talks about all the time. Is how does testing fit into Agile, or as I like to call it, just chaos? Like, it basically just means people. My interpretation of Agile is that it just means people were tired of process and someone telling them what to do, deadlines. So, and they don't want to think very far in the future. So, whatever, that's the state of engineering today. But how does testing fit into that, right? You can't change. Can't really test as a tester. You can't really impact or change that. Very few people can, even outside of testing. But how do you deal with it? Don't be part of it. It's very, very simple. Testers need to be looking at, a great tester is always looking at the entire, the risk of the entire project as a whole, right? And over time. And that's how they make their decisions on where to add test coverage, where are the vulnerabilities, where do we need testing, where do we have verification. And it doesn't matter what the flavor of the week is, or the stand-up issue of the day, or the story of that week. If they're all stories that are low risk and boring, you shouldn't be testing them as a tester. So testers should separate themselves from that urgency and chaos and cadence of stand-ups and stories and all that kind of stuff. People try to pretend there's a testing quality story, but it never works, because at the end of the week, they check their code in, and you've got the weekend to test it before they want to ship on Monday. So you have no time to even test. It's ridiculous. But don't fall into the ridiculousness. You got to stand up again, be brave, be creative, and say, I'm stepping away from that. It doesn't work for quality. It works for maybe engineering, and even then I'd argue incremental, not very big thinking engineering. And it has risks associated. with it, but I'm going to sit outside of that as a tester, and I'm not going to get caught up in that I'll call it stupidity. But I'm going to give you a great assessment of quality and do my best with the resources I have to mitigate that risk, right? That's what a great tester does in the world of Agile. Don't try to figure out how you fit in or adapt or whatever. And now I just killed, I think, 10,000 Agile coach jobs. So manual versus automation is always another topic, right? So what does postmodern testing kind of say about this when you think about it? So talk about manual testing. There's a very simple ratio of that I think is pretty consistent. You do your thing, you manipulate, but have a reason why you deviate from these ratios of the money, time, and resources you spend on regular sanity checks like BVTs, regression testing, exploratory testing, and thinking and learning, right? The other ones aren't super important. I mean, they're very, very important. But the big thing that's different about postmodern is, again, we need creativity in testing. Is it better that somebody takes, particularly in manual testing, it's an infinite problem. You can add 100 more test cases or 200 more test cases. Will anyone notice? No. But guess what's better? It's better as the tester that sits and just thinks at their desk or goes for a walk and realizes, oh, you know what? We have no coverage in this other area. We need to add test coverage over there versus adding another 200 test cases in an existing area, right? An example from, try to get some more examples from, we'll get some more real examples. On Google Desktop, on project when I took that testing over, we had 3,000 or 4,000 test cases, like literally 3,000 or 4,000 test cases, remote execution, overseas for a lot of it, slowed our release timings. And then I even sampled in there, and guess what? The stuff wasn't even some things were passing that weren't even in the product. So it was but so rather than just trying to figure out how to execute it more efficiently, my predecessor was trying to figure out how to execute those test cases efficiently at a low cost, right? But guess what? The best thing ever to do is sit back and go they're not adding much value. It's slowing down the process. Those features have been around there for a while. Just cut them. So we cut 3/4 or more of all those tests, kept a representative sample of them, so we catch anything major, and then we actually could analyze them and see if they were valid tests rather than just somebody clicking pass randomly. But that was because you take a step back as a tester or test lead or manager, and you think. You don't just execute or try to make things more efficient or chase down flaky bugs. You sit back and think. And manual testing is by definition stuff difficult for computers to do, takes creativity, but manual testers are just too much these days, too busy to think. So really, it's kind of crazy, but set aside not even 20% time on Google, which was kind of always a fraud in practice, but really think about what you're doing. It's the most significant bit you can have. Anyway, we've over-indexed on that. But that's what I really think about manual. And again, this kind of sounds like postmodern. We know it works and we know it doesn't work. But the most important thing is how do we combine those, put a twist on it that makes it an amazingly unique way to do testing. So talk about automation. There's a lot of stuff to say about automation, and there's a lot of drama in the community about automation. And again, very many different dogmas, different schools of thought, literally different tools, technologies, people skills, organizational things, cost structure, everything. It's an insane world today, which means we're not engineers, which means that we're basically ad hocing everything. And everybody disagrees, and everybody's got the newest flavor of the month. And I'm guilty as charged my entire life. So a few assertions. Automation should only be done by real programmers. And make a lot of people sad. If you're a manual tester and just been like code curious, you may call it, you should not be doing test automation, because test automation is the heart. It's easy to add code, to add a button to an. It's easy. In fact, a lot of those tools are drag and drop now to add a button to an application. That's called a developer. The hard thing is, how do I know to do, for example, things like testability APIs? How do I know how that button's going to break? How do I know how to not just add the button, but orchestrate that test across 10 different browser versions at scale and report on that? It's a much bigger testing problem, programming problem than most entry-level developers are. So if you're doing automation today and you don't have, we'll call it an experienced real programmer doing it, it's just going to be a cost suck and a mess. It's always a mess. Also, there's all these things. Everyone goes, well, how do I get my testers to, how do I abstract from the product, right? This is where I'll never be welcome back in the community. Maybe they'll cancel the STP chat or talk I'm going to give after this. But never do BDD. We won't talk about the details. Don't do Cucumber. If you're doing Cucumber, you're doing it wrong. How do I know you're doing it wrong? I had dinner to confirm the person actually created Cucumber. I had dinner at a conference, a few months ago. And I said, I've always heard you said this. I want to verify it from your mouth, like literally hear it from you, that Cucumber should not be used for testing. And he laughs. He's like, yeah, but I can't stop anybody. It's a bad way to write tests, but people do it. They can't help themselves. They chase these mirages of it's just another magic tool or magic approach. It's going to solve every problem. Model-based testing. I was at a $1 billion company, in the summer last year, chatting with the team. I asked, they had 3 SDETs, experienced SDETs with a great, strong test director, and who's smart, like really smart. And I asked them, trying not to be too nosy, but I'm like, so, how many tests do you have? Just on order of magnitude. Like, do you have like 100, 1,000, 10,000? Like, what are you doing? And they were like I was crazy, and they said none. And it's because they had this. They've been working for 18 months on a model to wrap their application, right? So they could write tests and have a framework where they could have non-testers write the test sequences and logic. It was this great, big, large plan. Guess what? The team redesigned that mobile app like just a few months ago. So they had to throw it all out because the entire flow of the app changed, logic, even some of the business aspects of it changed. So they threw it all out. They basically wasted 3 people times 18 months. And they could have been doing testing in that time. So most automation has nothing to do with testing or checking or verification. It's actually all the muck around it because testers want to pretend that they're a baby developer and this is their entry into that career path. They get paid a little bit more. They feel like they're a little more technical. I think it's a horrible thing going on in the industry. So really, and go back and Simon Stewart, who was one of the WebDriver creators, probably said it best. I've said this a couple of times publicly, but he said your engineer should be your tester because you have to understand the design, the business goals, the implementation, the risks even that each developer and bad patterns each engineer has when they write their code, let alone build all this other infrastructure around the application. It's a really hard problem. But for some reason, we throw people that are newbies or just curious or just dabbling at this really hard problem. And then what we end up with is all this kind of crud. And then nobody's happy with automation. So this is maybe even a little bit too strong, but that's what I've seen in the world. Also, everyone gets excited about having a lot of regrets. Fewer the better. If you're really smart, you just do very targeted testing, right? You don't have to test every little thing and every permutation because you know the risk. You know how to get more coverage and bang for your buck out of a test case. Don't just test everything. Also, people are saying, I think the total count of people in the webinar is down to 2. Just me, and STP folks. Okay. So there's a lot of assertions that people say automation is not testing. It's the way it's implemented today. I almost can see where people say that. The reality is, it's because people are trying to do the verification stuff and the rote stuff over and over again with a machine because it's boring and horrible and a waste of time. But that doesn't mean you do automation with it. Automation should be doing things that people can't do, right? Like measure things down to the millisecond, right? Or generate 10,000 inputs for a system, right? Or verify the health of 10,000 machines. A human couldn't possibly physically do that. That's where automation should be useful. And it should be generative. It not just doesn't replay rote tasks that a human does and clicking. The real powerful of automation and where it's successfully deployed with a positive ROI is always when it's generative. It does things that humans couldn't do without the help of the automation. Um, oh yeah, we need these are huge topics. Stop making new frameworks. We have enough, and they're always designed by junior engineers, and they're always a disaster. Microsoft, that's how you got promoted. If you want to get to management, you had to get two other teams to use your framework. So it's this battle of frameworks, and everyone, throwing out the old all the time. But they keep rebuilding the same crud, same ideas. Don't do testability APIs. That's a whole nother topic. If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong. And we'll show here the real way to do testing is this. This is more of a postmodern way to do testing. So if we have real programmers, the beautiful thing is this whole complex mess collapses to a singularity of clarity. If you test from the inside out, the problem with all the stuff I've talked about is trying to test from the outside of the application in. And that's a hard problem, right? How do you test the engine of a car when the hood's closed? That's a hard problem. So there's a thing that the Gmail guys figured out, and gals, I think there were gals, they may not have been. That I went up, so there's a story, like, I guess I'm an old man with a bunch of stories, but I think it makes it visceral and real. So I went to them because I felt so horrible because Chrome broke Calendar and Gmail, and they found it with their users. We didn't find it first, and I felt bad. So I talked to the team, and I just reached out and I go, give me all of your Selenium tests, and I will run them on every new build of Chrome. Like, I don't want to let you guys down and you have to debug browser problems, right? And looked at me like I'm insane, and they said, well, we don't use Selenium. And if you think about this, there was a Selenium farm at Google, and for a while they tried Selenium, but they dumped it. They dumped Selenium, they dumped all that lab stuff, and the reason was Gmail was a very complex app. And it looks a lot like apps with React. They're dynamic, they're data driven, they change on their own, they're not static, and so the techniques, classic techniques, like Magic ID, all the IDs were generated randomly. The IDs were actually like randomly generated. Like, good luck with that, right? So how do you test such a system? Only one real way to test it, and that is to test from the inside out. So if you look at this URL at the top, it's like a Gmail URL. Hopefully it doesn't have my auth token in it. Anyway, it's got, and you add an extra parameter at the end of it that says test is equal to, say, mark as unread, right? And all you do, the only framework you need on the planet, literally, if you're a good programmer, and you're writing tests as a good programmer, is when that page loads, you just inject a script, and it's really pretty. It's like 2 lines of code. We also inject the mark as unread tests.js file into the app, into the document. And then guess what you can do? Mark as unread test.js. Anything you want. You can see in the entire DOM. You can see the state of any element. You can even watch the app as it's executing. You can overload every REST call to have your own handler. You don't need another framework to deal with that. Deal with async kind of issues with REST calls or AJAX calls. You can even do, sorry, I get excited about this stuff. But you can even make calls to the backend to test the APIs from the exact same kind of context that the APIs will be called in a normal operation of the application, with all the same security context. It's amazing why we have for 30 years built all these extra artifices around the applications we're testing, when I think we actually have all along should have been testing from inside the app. There's a new framework called Cypress.io that it looks like it almost knows what it should be doing, but it doesn't still. It's just almost it's like a weak hybrid. It's kind of lower left in a weird way, but reality is an engineer on the app team, whether it's a web app or mobile app or a backend service, you just add parameters to say run this test, and then you can include this test code, and whatever will run in there runs in there. Anything the app can do, you can do. You're not blocked on testability APIs, but you have to understand how the app operates. And if you don't, sorry, your life is going to be painful. And you should probably allocate an engineer to write those tests that know what they're doing. Anyway, it's not going to be too preachy. But this is just, I think we've things inside out for a long time. This is like, back to this. Like, we've been building buildings, but guess what? We should blow a hole in the middle of it. That's a better building. And you know why? Because almost everyone's got a window view, right? And life is more interesting if you see something like that. You don't need a concrete bunker like in a sorry, it's probably a global webinar, but like in the Soviet Union, like they're functional buildings and waged buildings, but it's not exciting. It's not interesting. It's not very human, and it's definitely old school. So anyway, that's a little bit of kind of a rant on automation. We'll get to here. Instrumentation. I told the story before. A detail is that we had a bug in Chrome. Didn't know what the problem was, but guess who found it? It was the engineering director, because he just had a couple lines of code in his own little stupid little cheesy reporting dashboard, and he kept track of how many times different buttons were clicked in the browser. And he noticed that the back button was being clicked twice as often as usual. That's all he noticed. Didn't No tests, no nothing, no craziness. And we found out some very, very bad JavaScript bugs came out in that build. But you know that things are still working. You know that they're working in production and in staging and with your beta users, and you can find changes in the analytics. Just changes are indicative of user behavior changes or functional problems. You don't have to write 10,000 tests to find it. And when we figured this out, we had like 30,000 WebKit and JavaScript tests, unit tests, and integration tests, and none of them found the bug. But his little cheesy stuff found, a very important bug, and didn't require any code or testing. Microservices. There's a big secret to how the best I've ever seen this happen is at Google. There's two examples. One assertion is that if you are using an API, somebody else's API, do not rely on them to test the API for you. It's your problem. If you take the dependency, you have to write the tests. There's two ways to write the tests to verify that the thing works for you. One is you can sit and write your own, client calls on your end to verify and monitor that it's still functioning correctly. The best way is that all the code lives in the same tree, like it does at Google, and the client. So if Gmail takes a dependency, for example, on an API call on the back end from another server, the Gmail team goes into the code where that back end API is written and adds the test to that part of the tree, so that every time that microservices or API team rebuilds, the Gmail team's test would run and verify it works for them, because they know what contract they need. They know what parts of the API that they rely on. The microservices team can't know and can't be updated. So it's a real scalable way to help fix this microservices dependency changing problems. An example of this happened, just for nerd notes, back in WebDriver. So everyone knows what WebDriver is today. Back in the old days of, it was broken in Chrome. It worked for every other browser, but not Chrome. It's because Chrome kept changing and breaking WebDriver all the time. They changed the interfaces. So I was like, I'm work on automation for Chrome, and nobody can write tests on Chrome. So I'm like, how do I fix this? So I worked with a guy on my team, Joe, and what we did was we went ahead, as the WebDriver team just, by the way, the WebDriver folks worked for Google, and they just got sick of it because they were breaking all the time. So what we did was we added test cases for the things that WebDriver into the Chrome tree, and this is the check-in. I actually looked it up yesterday. I'm like, I think it's probably still out there, and it is. This is the code. So the Chrome team, like, basically as the test team added the WebDriver test for the WebDriver APIs that WebDriver needed, so that WebDriver would never be broken again. But this is an example. So it can happen in microservices and even on client software. It's a great model where the client owns the testing for the things that they need. Scales. Reporting. Everybody tries to build elaborate dashboards. So my friends do some really good dashboards. I've done them in the past. Nobody cares. Test counts don't matter. Percent pass and fail don't actually matter. The only thing the team really needs from the rest of the team needs from the testers is not a pre-dashboard or look like we do a lot of things. Nobody really cares. If they care, they're pretending. They don't actually care how many test cases you have. They want to know, is there any reason we shouldn't release? In the modern software world, the postmodern way to approach this is to say, we know what our role is and we'll advise you, and if we know the reason to block, if not, you go ahead and ship. The dev, whoever is trying to make that decision, makes that decision. We just advise, but we don't advise at the micro level. We don't say we were trying to hit a 72.6% pass rate. It doesn't mean anything. It's not a good representative sample, right? And because you have 100% of the tests that you happen to have written by this point in the project doesn't really mean anything. Like, it's the percent of what? What's the total set you should have? So those are just BS numbers. We should stop reporting them. Quantify quality. This is a larger topic, but we need to think about how to not just like, so what do we do if we don't have those numbers? We need to actually, there's very specific ways to measure complex, the quality of complex systems, not just crash rates either, but there's things like, how do you measure the relevance of a search engine, right? How do you measure things like trustworthiness of a UI? There's ways to quantify it. We don't have time to talk about it here, but there's also data quality metrics. You can look at the database and your backend and see, how many spelling errors are in our stuff, how many fields are inconsistent over time. There's a lot of ways to quantify quality mathematically. We need to do better as a field. So AI, probably people are like, why hasn't he talking about AI? So AI really will play a major role in transforming software testing. Like other people say, like Iran says, it can drive. It can play 5-on-5 Dota and destroy humans. It paints, like it does. It makes phone calls, and this is all in the last few years. It is definitely going to be able to test. There's not a lot of magic in most testing that goes on today. You think like AI is a fad? They're rewriting all of Google with an AI first approach, like all of it. They probably know what they're doing, right? More important, there's some of Google's AI test itself, test and train itself. Look up AutoML. You don't even need an engineer in the middle anymore. It can test itself. But the most important thing about AI is that it's going to mean, I've talked about this in other parts of the way on the interwebs, is that we're going to be able to reuse artifacts, share test cases and execution across applications and software teams. So there'll be a lot less demand to create coverage, and we'll have a lot more coverage, and it will be far less expensive. So in material, actually, this is the material impact of that is. Everybody knows what the testing pyramid is. If you're on this webinar, you know. There's arguments as to whether it's a triangle, a pyramid, or it could be like a panel of a dodecahedron or something in 5 dimensions or whatever, projected on the 2D plane. Doesn't matter. But what's interesting is that test cases at the bottom, which are tests, right in the top, they're UI tests or even qualitative tests. It's more expensive as you go up the pyramid. It's harder to write a UI test and more expensive than a unit test. What's interesting about AI, there's a whole talk about it. What AI is going to do is going to flip that upside down, like completely reorder this pyramid. It's going to turn it into a cake, a multi-layer cake. And the stuff at the top is actually the most cheapest now, the cheapest stuff. The hardest, most expensive things to generate will be unit tests because they're custom crafted to a specific function that a human wrote, right? But the AI can actually work from the top down very cheaply because you can write sets of test cases that can test all maps and applications or all search boxes or all login screens. And so it'd be pretty traumatic. People don't realize this, but the entire pyramid is basically going to be inverted, but they'll all kind of be about the same cost net. And so I will just flatten out into a cake. It won't be just a few of any type. You'll want to have examples of and probably similar coverage across up and down the stack. The only transition will be, so the AI will start competing at the top layer and eventually work its way down, where humans today work bottom up. It's going to invert the pyramid into a cake. This is a quick funny one. You could say it's biased, but I vended a lot of stuff in Chrome because the vendors were more experienced. And here's the funny thing, for testers listening, if your stuff can be vended out to somebody, that means your company doesn't care. So don't work on that stuff. Work on the 10% of your job that is valued, creative, and not vendorable out, right? So I spent all my time trying to figure out how I can vendor all of the busy work so I could work on the interesting problems when I was working on most of my projects, actually. So don't be afraid of vendors. Get rid of the stuff because there's an infinite amount of work. It just gets more and more interesting the more the stuff that you think you need to do is actually outsourced to somebody else. And it'll be easier for those vendors to just automatically test your stuff without knowing all the internal details. Last couple quick before we get into some Q&A. Some like other big don'ts, I would say. Code coverage and static analysis and test selection, just don't. I can talk about why, but just don't. But also, don't hire good testers. Good testers are worse than bad testers almost. Really, you'd be better off with 2 great testers than 20 or 30 bad testers, because bad testers will indulge in one of these old classic archetypes of they'll just do classical testing, right? Or they'll just do kind of modern testing, or they'll just do some bizarre, flavor that you hadn't heard of, that they invented themselves. So really hire great testers. It's better not to hire them if they're just good. Only hire great ones. And lastly, if you're on this webinar and you obviously care about testing and you're passionate about this space, please just don't leave the profession. That's the longest term thing I've seen, because if you leave early, you aspire to be a developer, you aspire to be a PM, because you're too cool for testing at some point, or you just want to go into management and be a director or something like that. I'll say a shout out to who's now promoted to a director, who I love, Kevin, but picking on him. But don't leave the profession. Don't leave testing. It's the biggest problem in software engineering. There's a lot of money spent on it. The best testers are really well taken care of, right? And how it relates back to postmodernism is you can only build, like, look at these buildings, these we talked about here. You can only build that if you knew how to do brick work and you knew how to like modern, even crazy extreme, metal and modern steel and concrete construction, right? You have to have been around the block to see that this idea could actually work and not roll away. If that rolled, that person's, you look dumb, right? To build something like this, you have to understand what happened before. So we need to have people that have been in the profession long enough and been on enough projects and project and testing role that they can look and see the patterns and see what's really working and what's not at a macro level, and have a competence and experience level that they can go, okay, I get the basics, but I'm going to just twist to it, right? I'm going to make it, I'm going to punch a hole in the building, and then it's awesome testing. That's how we go from just basic testing to awesome testing, and it takes essentially a postmodern approach to the testing profession to get there. Last note, I think Dave's probably watching, our head of marketing. He's super smart, and I make him nervous all the time. But is this then too? What's postmodernism? And I'll leave everyone with this. There's actual Wikipedia entry for it in the art world, but guess what it says? It's not really formed yet. We're postmodern world. Because a weird thing, you almost have to end with postmodernism because it is the collection of everything, right? And the magic thing about it is you're combining all these different previous works and disciplines. So there's not really an entry on it, but I'll give you a quick view. This is something we're working on. It's early UI. Don't panic. The CSS isn't done, but to show how things are going to be disrupted in testing, we hope to be releasing a site soon where anybody can go in, search for their app, right? And guess what happens? I haven't talked to the Walmart folks about this. Like, we've already tested their mobile app, right? We use AI and some more modern approaches, and we also know what's important, what's not in terms of performance. But in a postmodern world, crazy things happen. If we combine a lot of traditional things where humans are running the tests, but AI can execute at scale, and we can execute the same test on multiple apps, we can even benchmark that app against its competitive apps. So we know how the flows compare. We know how the performance changes on different types of screens. And this will radically, I think, change software quality, because quality is not one person in a cubicle saying, well, 20 of the 21 tests I had passed, so I think we should ship. Right? And I think, and by the way, the page feels like it's kind of fast to me, or it's faster than a second. That should be good enough. No, like the Walmart guys at Walmart should be able to look at the product page load time on their app and compare it to Target and Amazon and know where they fit in stack rank and use that information to decide if their app is fast enough or slow enough and know that it's possible to be faster. It opens a whole new world on testing and quality and benchmarking. And AI will open that up. So that's kind of where this is the twist. Um, this is the twist, right? Where we are here. This is the twist on top of this building. Yeah, we can automate it. We can do it in cool ways and awesome ways, but we're so competent and we have such a good data and postmodern approach to testing that we can come up with new ways to evaluate quality that add even more value and excitement and more value back into the engineering teams from the test team. So there you go. I'm Jason Arbon again, a handsome man, and I love talking about testing and geek out on it. So you can reach me at all sorts of places. I'm happy to get in touch with people, especially if you want to think apply AI to the testing problem. I'm always willing to geek out or try to be useful. So thanks for putting up with this intro to postmodern testing. This is the first audience I've shared it with anybody on the planet. Let's see if anybody's still here. Is anybody still here?
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Thank you so much for your insightful session. We do have questions right now.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's do them. I can stay on a few
Yeah.
minutes later too if it's interesting.
Okay. So no, we do have a couple of minutes and a couple of questions. So I'm going to quickly check what all questions we have. All right. So there is one from Kevin Parker, and I'm still waiting on him to reframe his question while we move on to the next one. Okay. So the question goes like this. Can Jason comment on what ways Cucumber offers a bad way to write tests?
Sorry, I missed the middle of that. Can I comment on what way of writing bad tests?
Yeah. Can Jason comment on what ways Cucumber offers a bad way to write
Cucumber. Okay,
tests?
because we
Yeah.
have limited time, just look up the guy who invented cucumber and then read what he said, first of all. So for me, like, what do I know? Maybe I'm biased, right? But just, I forget his name. I forget his name right now. Just look up cucumber inventor and read what he said on it. Ignore me. But the biggest problem with cucumber in practice is that, and he knows this is the problem, is that you have create a whole software project in its own. So now, instead of directly testing the application, you have to build an abstraction layer, right? Then you have to create a new language, some way to represent these abstract concepts to get mapped into function calls so that non-testers can write them. That's in the Cucumber, Gherkin, BDD style text files. I think it's so. I'm a tester and I want to add a new test case that wants to click this button. Well, now we have to have the developer essentially write a testability API for that thing, make it testable and executable. Update this model that wraps it with a few scarce software design engineers and test to update that model, and then ultimately then that gets exposed vocabulary item into the Gherkin, so you can actually express a test case to click that button. That is the most complex stack to click a button you can invent, and it is you end up creating. You have mostly entry-level, inexperienced engineers building a very complex model, kind of semi-declarative language into wrapping the application and executing and driving that application. So it basically adds a burden. There's a military term, like if there's, it's probably bad to use, but if basically it adds a burden on the engineering team, it adds a burden to these STATs that should be writing generative code, but they're not. They're just subservient, like checks basically all the time, a verification kind of tests that are written by people that don't understand the application and don't understand how hard their requests are in terms of extending the model so that Cucumber can execute against it. And then lastly, when those things fail, you now have to not only debug the application, you have to debug that mapping layer, debug the logic of the Gherkin or the Cucumber. It's a very simple rule is the more layers you removed away from the actual application implementation, the far more complex it is, the far more expensive it is, the far slower it is, not even execution speed, but just time to value. And you very quickly hit diminishing return. It sounds good on paper. Hire a bunch of less expensive testers that can write the basic tests and have some magic, junior engineers in the middle to somehow translate that into driving the application that amplifies their the coding ability. And it actually almost every case it does the opposite. Almost every case I've seen.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. And now we are actually running out of time, so I'll just ask a couple of more questions, and suddenly we have a volley of queries coming in. So, what we'll do is the questions which are not responded to here on the call, we will send them to you, and you can probably write some short responses to them, and we'll put them up on
Sure.
the blog
Yeah, I'm happy.
for you.
Sounds good.
So, I'll just ask a couple of more questions. Great presentation regarding separating yourself from agile processes. A lot of testers do not have the autonomy to do this. Do you have any suggestions for strategies where you are forced to participate in an agile process while still maintaining your sanity?
Yep.
Maybe we need a subgenre of postmodern testing to subvert agile, like post-punk testing or something, perhaps.
Yeah. So there's a very brutal answer to this. If to be brave, that goes back to that slide about being brave, right? Um, you should if you're stuck in that environment, you're actually part of the problem, part of the quality problems in that team. If your goal is quality, you basically what you're doing is you're building a bad resume for yourself. So the number one easiest thing to do is actually there's a lot of testing jobs. Find a testing job where people let you do that. So spend a lot of your time on LinkedIn during the day and interviewing, and find a place where you can actually grow your career and feel like you can actually do what you're supposed to be doing in your role. Uh, there's you could also be spending the time instead of writing more test cases and being stressed, figure out how to lobby the existing team. Talk about how it would be different. Build the case. If you just walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, I want to do something non-standard. I want to build a building that looks like this," they'll say no, right? By default, no. But you have to come in with a much stronger story, right? And that's why I'm going to try to help giving more data and trying to present this stuff here, this content. Because what happened, I experienced like the people overuse like the how Google test software book. People go, oh well, this is how Google did it. So when I have like giant companies trying to call me and thank me for how they transformed their organization, I was like what do you do? And I'm like, maybe that's not useful in your work. That may be a bad thing. But if it was written in a book called How Microsoft Tests Software or How Google Tests Software, um, that stuff people can take those texts and those screenshots of that book back to their manager. They give the book to their manager. The managers read it. That softens up the industry. It'll take time, right? But so I'm trying to get some content out so that people can say, see, here's a book on it, or here's a bunch of material on it, and why it's good and why it's bad, and why this is a better model. So I'm just trying to start that process to make it easier for people. But the real thing is, be brave. Design a building like say this is the way it should be. And the funny thing is, most testers, the reason most testers aren't quite paid as much in the organization is because they're too quiet. They don't themselves. You'd be amazed if you push back on a dev manager or director of dev and you say, whoa, or their agile coach and stuff. We've got this all wrong. Like this is how I can deliver the best quality. And these are the problems with the model we have today. You'd be surprised how many people go like, oh, well, obviously you've thought about it me, let's try it. You'd be very, very surprised, but very few testers, even by personality, were cautious, risk averse, and downstream. We won't be brave. We're not brave enough. So if you're not going to be brave enough and you're not going to leave the job, and I don't know what to say, that's just what'll happen. But eventually, your career will not have like a postmodern kind of flavor to it. You won't have the experiences. You'll be associated, by the way, and I'll quit ranting about this. The worst thing is you'll be associated with a crappy. So if you're on a team
Hmm.
where you don't think you can deliver high quality, your resume now is people go, oh, that app? I've used that app. It crashed all the time. Like, awesome. Well, am I gonna hire you next? So career wise, put yourself in a position to succeed and you have to be a little bit brave.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. I'll just take the last question right now and we'll send the rest of them to you.
Cool.
Um, yeah. So the question says, maybe I'm wrong, but it looks like testing as a separate part, I mean, independent testing, is going away and developers will do the testing itself with AI driven tools.
Um, I well, this is where I get in trouble. I think people that do checking or rote verification, um, a lot of that work actually will be going away. Farmers are getting tractors. It's happening, and they need less. work hands on the farm, because the farmer can drive the tractor himself. And now it's even automated with GPS. Like, you just don't need that many farmers anymore. But what you do need, there are giant collections of farms. Some farmers are actually very rich because they've figured out how to scale their business, or they just sold land, right? So I really believe, and this change is going to happen faster than it happened to farming. Um, uh, but my buddy Jeff at Dell has some good presentations on this and talks about it. But yeah, the boring work is going to go away. It just is. But that's what I'm saying is, fight for the 90% of stuff that build the top of this building. Don't build the plumbing. Don't work on the sink. Focus on the hard testing problem. How do I quantify the quality here? How do I have a strategy that's not just repeating what was done before? How do I change up my agile pattern in the team, right? How can I even fake, for example, how can I fake that I'm part of the agile team, but I'm really not? People don't really look into testing that much. You can kind of be left alone. So act like you're going to stand-ups, but think globally and holistically. And write 1 or 2 quick tests for the stories that week, but spend 80% of your time working on the legacy stuff that needs to be done, or future work to enable yourself to be more efficient over the long haul with your test automation. So really, you have to be aggressive about it, and decide you're going to do it, and then just do it. But all those stuff that you think is boring and busy and is not in your organization, that type of work is and will be going away. But the jobs that are left behind, there's still an infinite amount of testing work to be done. It's not like those disappear. That work disappears. There'll be glorious, fun testing problems to work on. But only the brave and the curious and the people that are pushing the limits will be competent enough to address that top 10%, the higher 10% of the work of testing.
That's pretty. That's actually that makes a lot of sense to look at testing this ways. So thank you, Jason. Thank you so much for your insightful session, and uh, I'm sure that all the attendees found it very informative and useful. So thanks again, Jason, and I hope to see you in San Francisco.
Awesome, thanks. Yep, we'll see too much of each other, and appreciate it, and love to be associated with STP. It's pretty fun.
Very
And
happy to hear that.
Hope I didn't have, if people start want their money back for the conference. Sorry, I just try to.
No, we're not going to have that situation, and we are not canceling any of your sessions. So you're pretty much going to be there. Thank you
All
so
right,
much.
we'll all be there. All
Yeah.
right, thanks. See you guys.
Well, everyone, this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining, and more importantly, thanks for being so engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and community. If you want to see more such sessions from the speakers like Jason and others, and wish to learn from them about testing, please do come over to STPCon Spring 2019. And stay tuned for more webinars and online trainings, which are coming soon at SoftwareTestPro.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the upcoming webinar, which is the QA supporting DevOps the smart way by Melissa Tondi on 13th February, then please do it. The link is up for registration at SoftwareTestPro.com. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week ahead, and see you all in San Francisco in April 2019. Keep practicing your testing skills. Thank you.